Welcome to Grief Uprooted, a podcast dedicated to sharing your grief stories. Together, we embark on the mystery of one's grief journey as they learn to live, heal, and be courageous in a world rooted in trauma. Join myself, Christine, in an open discussion to help you uproot the grief in all our lives. I am an award winning author, professional speaker, and humanitarian in the field of grief and trauma. I want you to be part of the discussion. And as this being the first of many podcasts, I think the best way to explore grief is to understand those who grieve together heal together. And I want to take you on a journey. I want to take you on the journey of my grief story. So please sit back and walk with me through my sorrow, through my pain, and through the courageous moments I had. Where's Robert? That is the title of my grief story. 1986, June 21st. A very peaceful but joyful street full of children, Queen Street, in a little town in Ontario. Life was easy. It was full of friends. It was full of laughter. My mother ran a daycare. My father was a businessman in the city. My older sister had just recently gotten married to a police officer. And my older brother was embarking on the age of 19 and what he was going to do with his life. He loved motorcycles and old cars. As a vibrant, joyful redhead, bouncing around, often being told, "Stop talking, you're talking too much. What are you doing now?" Always waking up just thinking, today is going to be a good day. I'm excited to be alive. I was that girl who was in that special education class. She has a comprehension problem. She doesn't seem to be able to stay focused on one thing long enough. Doesn't seem to understand the words in a book. So they placed you in a class in 1980s where they're going to let you go at your own pace. This class consisted of 9 boys and me. Thank goodness I liked motorcycles. Thank goodness that I could pretty much play with the boys and not feel any different. My brother and I were quite inseparable, actually. We would roller skate together, play with mini bikes together. It was often a good time. We had our spats. I remember arguing over who's putting the garbage out to, regular sibling things. My sister was all grown up and married and having her first child and ran her own store. As this young 14-year-old, you looked up to these people. You were excited about life. My school years in that year was 1986. I was in the special ed class, and my teacher, Mrs. Kerr, she had followed me all through the grades. But for this year, grade 8, I was without her. And I did okay, I thought. I passed all my subjects. I thought I was moving in the right direction. Until it came to that day in picking high school. And they took me aside and said, "We're sorry. Your marks are not good enough to go to the regular high school that all your friends were going to." I had no idea that I was actually that different. I thought I was just special because I was in the special education class. And soon enough, when I went home, I said to my parents, "I'm not going to high school. I've decided that's not an option. I don't want to go to the school that they're asking me to go to. I want to go to the one that all my friends are going to." Luckily, my parents are quite courageous and they fought for me. They went to the school and the meetings, and I remember sitting outside the hall and my mother coming out and this teacher coming out, Miss Maisie, and she said, "You're going to high school and you're going with your friends." I was so excited. "But you're taking all basic and you're going to be in a special education class." I said, "Okay, as long as I get to go, as long as I get to dress in the same uniform and walk through the same door, I'm there." I was ecstatic. So the year was coming to an end and prom was coming up. The end of grade 8, which was quite a big ordeal back then and is even a bigger ordeal now, bigger ordeal. So as I was nearing this big date, I was off on a Saturday with my sister and we were at her children's store and she made children's clothing. And it was quite a nice day. I just remember the sun. I remember laughing with her and creating all these clothing. And I loved making the hair bows. The hair bows were my favorite. And it was so fun to have customers come in and be able to dress the children. And so that day we were working away on all the things that she wanted to make and put together. And all of a sudden, middle of the day, her husband comes in, who's a police officer, and he says, "Pack up, clothes, now." My sister and I, similar in humor, are joking around and we're like, "Hey, are we going to the local amusement park? Where are we going? Like, what's the big deal?" Obviously not taking anything serious, just joking and laughing, and we're slowly packing everything up. And I just recall him like asking us to hurry up, and we started packing things quicker. And then as we locked the door, I can see it clear as day, the door sliding and the key turning, and we start to walk towards a blue style station wagon. And she starts to get into the front seat, and I notice there's a family friend in the back. And as I open the door, I'm, "Hey, how's it going?" And as I sit in the car, the mood is felt, the tension is felt, and this uncomfortableness is felt. And as a young girl, I had never really experienced this feeling. And all of a sudden, he looks at me and he says, "Your brother is dead." I remember watching my sister try to process this information. And I remember thinking in my own head, what does this mean? And when I looked back and I said, "What exactly do you mean?" And he said, "Your brother has fallen over Niagara Falls Gorge to his death." That feeling of pain over 30 years later still sits with me. That moment, the smell in the air, the face of that family friend will never leave me. As we drove down the highway, as our home was about 20 minutes away from the store, my mind started going and was trying to figure out, like, what did death really mean? And it started to come to reality that this means I'm never going to see my brother again, right? And as we drove into the driveway, and it was lined with people, our own home was lined with people, family and friends were there. And I remember opening the door and people saying, "Oh, Chrissy, I'm so sorry." I mean, not quite understanding really what was happening. And then when I looked to the porch and I saw my father lay his arm on the red brick of our home and say, "I can't take this. I can't do this." And then the moment he saw me, he became the strongest man in the world. He wrapped his arms around me. And at that point, I still didn't understand. What did death mean? As I entered into the house, again, people, food. If everybody wasn't crying, it would feel like a party. And my mother looking at me and going, Chrissy, and wrapping her arms around me. I remember standing there saying to myself, this isn't true. This isn't real. This is like a movie, right? Something that this can't be real. I must be dreaming. And I remember my mind kind of going back, like floating backwards and thinking, this is all made up. And that dream that I had been creating, or that reality I was starting to form, clearly was evident to the rest of the people, because somebody came up to me and said, here, we've got these vitamins and we think you should take them, and they taste like candy. And I just did. I took them. And I remember at that point, when them handing them to me, I was kind of giggling and kind of like not taking it like I should. I really don't have words for that. And I know a lot of us in our grief stories stand there and go, really can't articulate this in words, but I clearly didn't want to accept, I think would be a great analogy to say. But slowly the vitamins started to take effect on me. And I remember jumping up and starting to cry and scream my brother's name. And I remember seeing my mother, my father, my sister wrap themselves around me. This was all so new for me. No one ever talked about death. I didn't even know what it was. I had no concept. I just knew I felt this horrible, horrible, horrible pain inside. And I wanted it to leave. And I think for me, that's when the bottle formed. That's when I decided, I can't handle this. I don't want to feel this. And it's like being in a jar. It's like locking yourself into this bottle and watching the world go by. And it felt safe. I had somewhat control over what I let in and didn't let in. And as the days went on and we started to go to the funeral and visitations, I recall dressing up in a pink dress with gray polka dots and my big red hair and going to the funeral. I remember seeing my classmates there. That I will never forget. All 9 boys. And as the funeral came to a close, Rob was buried. I see it all in my mind. It was like I wasn't really there. It was as if I was watching a movie still. So I went to that prom. I had my father drive me on the back of his Harley. We all loved motorcycles, even to this day. So he drove me to my grade 8 prom on the back of his Harley. And I recall him saying, "Are you good?" And I said, "Yeah, Dad, I'm good. I'm good." And I went to my prom. That summer, it was tough. I often would walk by Rob's room, just wondering, like, where are you? Where did you go? I would lie in his bed, look at his CDs. I recall just smelling his pillow and his clothes just so I could see if I could find him. As the days went on, things were so much different. You lose a pet. That's the only thing I could really relate this to. And often if we lost a dog, we did have like a funeral and we buried the dog, but mom and dad went back to work. They were happy again, you know, in a couple months. The dog is like our family, but this was so different in the sense that they weren't going back to work. They weren't bouncing back. And I didn't understand. They explained that animals had a different lifespan than ours. But all this just ended up falling on deaf ears because the jar was so safe and so comfortable. I started high school and I was so excited to join the basketball team. I'm 6 foot redhead. And I was excited about sports. I had done a bit in public speaking actually in grade school. And this was going to be a whole new world for me. These people didn't know about Rob, and I could start over. That's really what it felt like for me. And I remember walking in that school hall and thinking, yeah, I got this. I made it. Until they showed me my classroom. I think I was in a closet with two other people. And I just remember sitting in this closet going, really? And they were like, well, we're going to let you have some extra time and some support here. And thank goodness this was just my area for support, because then I got to go off to a real classroom eventually and give it a try. See what it was like if I could keep up with everybody else. And I just remember people saying, she's not comprehending. And me kind of looking back at people and wondering, like, what exactly are they talking about? Because I hear them. So then I just remember going into my first math class and working away and so excited that I was part of the so-called mainstream classroom and struggling to really, it was like Charlie Brown talk. And every time that somebody would pick on my hair color, my height, it was as if I could open a jar and place that into. So not only in this jar was the death of my brother, now in this jar contained, I was in the special education class and didn't know why. Just I had a comprehension problem. And I was different. I started to realize that 6 foot redhead doesn't come along every day. And now I'm having educational issues. And I started to hear whispers. That's the girl whose brother fell over Niagara Falls Gorge. I started to really notice I'm different. So as the years went on in high school, I struggled. But I was so excited to be part of this basketball team. And I remember trying out, making the team. And during this time, I had this large mass start to grow on my leg. And my coach kept saying, "What's wrong with your leg?" And I'm like, "I'm not sure. It just hurts." And I just tried to just ignore it and place it in this jar again. And I consciously didn't realize I was placing things in a jar, but I knew I was placing them somewhere in my mind. And then one day he looks at me and he's like, you're going to have to go to the doctors. And I'm like, I got this. I got this. My parents are dealing with so much right now. I've got this. And sure enough, it got to the point where I couldn't walk. It started to hurt so much. And I just remember being in a room with my parents. My parents were sitting in these two chairs, and this Dr. McIntyre was sitting in front of them. And he looked out and he said, I'm really sorry, but I'm not sure if your daughter has bone cancer, but we're going to have to do surgery. And at that very moment, I remember thinking, I'd like to see Rob. I really would. But now I'm struggling with my own mortality. What if I die? I don't even know what it means. No one taught me about this. And I remember looking at my parents and just seeing the fear on their faces. This is just my perception of what happened from a children's perspective. But it was scary. And I just remember waking up from that surgery. And the doctor would call me Sunshine. And he's like, Sunshine, because you must have an angel watching over you. And I was a teenager. I got to tell you, I wanted to tell this guy just to go bleep off. And he says, you don't have cancer. He goes, you have osteomyelitis, rare bone disease or bone infection found in older people. I remember looking back at this guy and thinking, what does that mean? And why do I have it? He hands me a pair of crutches. And just as he hands me those crutches, he says, Sunshine, I know one thing in life. If you don't deal what's emotionally hurting you, you will physically kill yourself. Let me say that again. If you don't deal with what's emotionally affecting you or killing you, your body will kill itself. Essentially what this man was saying to me, if you don't deal with your emotional crap, it's going to affect you physically. Tried to say that 3 different ways for you. I just remember being a teenager not wanting to accept these words. And off I went with my crutches. And now here I was in high school. The girl in the special education class that went to the closet every once in a while. A 6-foot redhead whose brother supposedly jumped over the Niagara Falls Gorge to his death. And now I'm on a pair of crutches. I would walk that hall and I'd balance myself on those crutches and I'd kick open the doors as I went down. Slowly, all these events and grief were piling into this jar. It was as if I didn't have to feel if I placed everything into a jar. But what happened after that was exactly what Dr. McIntyre said. The top of the jar would all of a sudden pop open. And when it did, it was like a wave of emotions. It was like, it was just like being flooded with pain. And I remember not being able to handle that. I remember my head hurting, and I remember just going to the nurse's office and saying, "My head is killing me." And they would say, "You have a migraine," and they would give me a shot of Demerol in my ass and put me to bed. And I would wake up the next day and the cycle would start again. I started to learn coping mechanisms for all this. I realized if I opened the jar that I could scream it out. I could scream out this pain that I was feeling. I used to pin my rock posters on the wall, and I used pins on purpose so that if I needed to scream and just rip the posters off the wall, I could do that without wrecking the English wallpaper my mother put up. It was a very trying time in my life. A time I thought would never, ever end. But it slowly did. As I healed, I got rid of the crutches. I learned to trust and use my leg again. I never did get to make it onto the basketball team. But I remember a day that I was so excited. I still lived in the jar, and it worked for me. But I was in that math class with that teacher, and he said to me, "Could you just stay after class one day?" And I did. And he said, "Read to me what you see on the board." And I started to read it. And he says, "What if I told you to read from the other side?" I said, "Why in the world would I do that? Why would I read from the other side of that would be wrong?" He goes, "Try it." So I did. He goes, "Let me write a sentence." He wrote a sentence. He said, "Tell me what you're doing with the sentence." And I said, "Well, I can flip it. I can turn it. I can actually make it go backwards." And he goes, "Write what you see." And I did. And he goes, "What if I was to tell you that that's actually forward?" And I went, "No." "But what if?" And I said, "So the rest of the world is backwards? Why in the world would people be doing that?" And then he said, "Why don't you try looking at everything backwards?" I graduated from high school with a scholarship once I realized the rest of you are all backwards. Turned out I'm dyslexic. No wonder I couldn't comprehend anything. I couldn't read it. Soon I learned to read from the other side of the sentence. Soon I learned the is not E-H-T, it is T-H-E. And as time went on, I was able to put these skills to work. And I started to understand things better. I started to see the world a little different. But I still struggled emotionally. So as high school comes to an end and I receive my scholarship, it's, what are you going to study? I wanted to study death and dying, of course. And of course, everybody was like, "Dear, maybe you should go talk to somebody. Maybe you should go see, somebody and talk about these feelings." And I'm like, "I'm fascinated. I want to know what this is. I want to know what this is I experienced. I want to understand it." I could look at everything from a perspective of no emotions. So I was able to dive into these things and not have an emotional reaction. So I went off to college and I started to study, and there was nothing on death and dying that didn't exist. So I started to do human relations. And my first course, I went up to do a presentation, and the professor looked at me and said, "You have 100% in this class." And I looked back and he goes, "You're studying yourself. You're the little redheaded girl. whose brother fell over Niagara Falls. And I just remember thinking, little, I'm 6 feet tall. But he was an older gentleman, and I looked back and I said, I quit. The last thing I want to do is study myself. So I left college and I became a hairdresser. Such a turnaround, 180, spun in the other direction. This is too much. You're making me feel, and I don't want to feel. So I became a hairdresser, quite successful. I ran hair salons for a larger corporation. I realized I was good with talking to people. I was creative. I understood people's pain from a perspective that not a lot of people did. And everyone tells their hairdresser everything. But as time went on, I got married to my high school sweetheart. And I just remember him saying, who's the guy on your grandmother's mantle? You're hugging each other. And I remember my response being, I think that's my brother. And my grandmother often would look at me and she would say, Chrissy, wake up. I never really understood what she was saying half the time. I do now. But after we were married and ready to have our first child, I recall the birth of Jacob and looking down at this little boy and thinking, I know you. You remind me of someone. And soon after that, I had created a closer bond with that grandmother, and I'd visit her on every Thursday. Every Thursday we got together. And Jacob would play in the backyard or swim in our pool, or my grandfather was an apple farmer. To this day, that boy still eats apples in the droves. And I remember one day just being so excited to let her know that I had some exciting news. They lived on a little farm in Niagara-on-the-Lake, and I come bouncing through that back door to this day, and Jacob was walking up the stairs, and life was great. It was simple again. I didn't recall much of my past. I remember thinking my sister always had like this movie where she was able to talk about us as children, and I never really felt the movie or saw the movie. So this day I pull out 2 teacups because we always had tea. And I remember hers being this yellow, paley yellow cup, and mine was this white one with these blue flowers. And as I poured the tea, I looked over at her and I saw her playing with Jacob. And I walked over and I placed the tea down in front of her, and she looked up at me and she said, "You're pregnant." And I was like, "How do you know that?" And she said, "Look it, I've birthed 9 children. I know when a girl's pregnant." I said, "Yes, I am. I'm so excited." And we sat and we talked about babies and what I wanted to do the rest of my life, in the sense of how many children did I want. And she was so accepting of me and who I was. And I could tell she was proud of me. And had I known that was going to be my last Thursday with her, I would have said so much more. I received a phone call that she had a stroke and she fell into a coma. And I recall rushing to the hospital and standing beside her bed. And she was still coherent at that point. Somehow she had that ability to still speak, and often thought she was waiting for her last child to arrive. And before she slipped away, she looked at me and said, "Chrissy, I will say hello to your brother Robert." I recall that bottle that I created shatter, just shatter. She said, "It's time to wake up." And boy, did I wake up. I ended up delivering a baby girl. And every time I look at that little girl, who now is an adult, I think of my grandmother. She shattered the bottle I created. I went into work the next day and I quit my job. I looked at my family and said, "Where's Robert?" And they all stared back at me. And that's when my journey started. That's when I decided I'm going to find Robert. So I embarked right back to the funeral home that I recalled as a childhood. I remember walking through the door and the gentleman saying, "Little Chrissy." I now understand what little means. It's the words of endearment. It's these older people calling this young girl. And I said, I need to put the pieces together. I need to understand what happened. So as I started venturing and walking through the funeral home, I said to him, "I have these memories and I'm scared of what they are." And I feel this texture in my hands. And when I look at my hands, I see it's red. And I'm so frightened of these memories I have that I don't know what they are. So he took me into this room, and it was in the back, and it was this like little alcove of a room. And as I walked into the room, I ran my hands over the wall. And all of a sudden, I started to feel what I was seeing. I started to see myself as a child. And as I continuously ran my hands and felt the wall, all these memories came back. I said, "This wallpaper." He goes, "It was up and down the halls." And he goes, "When you were here as a child, you walked up and down the halls, you paced, and your hand ran over the red wallpaper." I was able to realize that it wasn't something horrific. It was a feeling that my physical body remembered. And it brought back all the memories of this funeral. I then went on to go where my brother had fallen. And I learned that he hopped the rail to take a pee. Yes, at 19 years old, he didn't listen to the sign. He hopped it and thought he was just standing on grass, and it was actually the tops of trees, and he had fallen through and hit concrete. And then the water comes over in intervals, and that took his body into the Maid of the Mist, or the Hornblower, it's called now. So the pieces were coming together. But as I was pulling all these pieces together, I was thinking in my mind, what if this happens to my children? What if this happens to other children? I started to research for books and things on grief for children. There was nothing. And it was so disappointing that nobody even approached the topic. We never learned about it in school. Every time you would start to bring it up or talk about it, people went silent. So I decided I was going to write a book, and I was going to title it, Where's Robert? So as some say in my family, I locked myself in the basement and I started writing. And I started writing the story of a little girl named Chrissy who was looking for her brother Robert. In all the research I had done, I had came to the answer. Rob lives on in me. He has the same blue eyes as me, the same crazy curly hair as I do, the same laughter, the same quirks. He lives on in my father, my mother, my sister, their children, my children. Where's Robert is within my family, within my love, within my memories. That is where he is. So I soon put together a book called Where's Robert? A Children's Grief Kit. And with this book, if you recall that blue suitcase that I put the halves of everything in, I decided I would create a memory box that would go with it so everybody could have their blue suitcase. And then I decided that they needed a journal because everyone needs to tell their story. We need to hear it. And then I put a set of Crayola crayons in it. I wrapped it up and I went to the bank. And I remember sitting at the bank and them saying, "What's your marketing plan?" Because there's nothing on the market that's like this. I said, "I'm going to tell my story. I guarantee I will be on the front page in the newspaper because I'm going to be vulnerable and share my grief." Sure enough, that next week, I was on the front page of the newspaper and they gave me a loan just enough to print 1,000 books. To my dismay, Chapters and wouldn't carry it. They said it wasn't marketable. And I sold about 22 books a week. And I would go off to funeral homes mainly, hospices. I remember photocopying the book as a business store at a business store and somebody coming up and asking if they could have a copy of it. And for sure I was sharing it and they wanted to give me money. And I never looked at it like that. I looked at it as this is my way of saying thank you to my grandmother and thank you to my school teachers and my parents and everyone for understanding that I was in this bottle. And eventually I was able to come to the grips of it all. And I learned emotional denial is quite a technique or an ability we have to protect ourselves as we slowly process the sorrow that we experience in life. So here I was with 2 kids in tow and the author of the first grief book that really came out in Canada. And then the night of September 11th, 2001, was the terrorist attacks on the trade towers and the Pentagon. I remember the world just sitting there and staring at our TVs, watching the horror, feeling helpless. I remember just thinking, thank God my family's safe. I remember just feeling that sorrow and empathy for the families that were enduring this, and just shock. I think to this day, everybody talks about that day and they say where they were and how they heard about it. But that night, September 11th, my phone rang. And as I picked it up, it was like I had a little desk at the end of my bed that I used as my little office. And this man says, "Hello, I'm calling from the Walter Reed Medical Center. And I'm looking for a woman. She's a 6-foot redhead. I think her name is Chrissy." And I said, "You're speaking to her?" And he says, "I have this book in my hand. And I have over 5,000 children who are grieving the loss of a loved one. I need to order 5,000 copies of this book." Do you know what my answer was? "Yeah, sure, buddy. And I'm Jesus Christ." And I hung up the phone. The phone rang really quick. And I remember him saying, "Look, lady, are you watching the news?" I said, "Yes, I am." He goes, "You got a fax machine?" I said, "Yes, I do, sir." And I looked down and this big emblem comes out. And he says, "We're setting up a place, World Trade Book Center. It's for people to go to get books on grief. We've searched high and low for something for children. We have your book. And I need 5,000 copies." I said to this man, "Okay, I can do this." I hung up that phone. I looked at my family and said, "I have to do this." And I called the media, the newspapers, and my community bound together. Bell Canada put in all these extra phone lines in my house. People I didn't even know were coming over to volunteer. People wanted to donate money. Our local bank opened up a bank account for us. It was amazing how many people were reaching out. How many people could say, "I know that I have felt grief too." And while they called to help and support, some would share stories, some wouldn't share stories. We started receiving letters from children who were expressing the loss of their family members, the loss of their pets, the loss of their siblings. Everybody started to share their grief. It was the most amazing thing to me. And I was so excited. So we put out a call to all the children to send us letters. And inside our grief kit, that box that resembled my blue suitcase, we're going to place your letters. So that's what we did. I was so happy and felt I was able to see the good that I was able to bring from something so horrific that I experienced. As time went on, we ended up actually doing 8,000 copies of Where's Robert to the trade towers and the Pentagon. This changed my life. And as this episode comes to an end, this began the start of my career. Until we meet again, Know that when we grieve, if we grieve together, we heal together. And this is a place for not only you to share your grief story, but for all of us to heal our minds, bodies, and spirit. Take this journey with me. Walk with me, not only through your grief, but through the grief of others. And together, not only will we heal us, we will heal the next generation. And we're going to tackle stuff like ancestral grief. We're going to tackle all of it, but we're going to do it together. Until next time, take care and know that your grief story matters. Bye.